Yes, it's just gone 33 minutes past 9, and we thank Mohammed Arai for the last segment on air with Arai talking about the Daily Maverick and their new ventures in the field of journalism. But right now, going across our Facebook page as well as on YouTube, and now today for the first time on our Twitter handle, you can get all of these latest video interviews. Next up, I'm going to be speaking to Professor James Blignau. He's a professor extraordinaire attached to the School of Public Leadership at Stellenbosch University. He is also an honorary research associate attached to the South African Environmental Observation Network. And we are talking about extending credit to unsustainable agricultural enterprises. Good morning, Professor, and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you for having me, and good morning to the listeners.
All right, let's first look at the concept around unsustainable agricultural enterprises. What would you actually say is unsustainable in the farming industry?
Thank you. Yeah, I think what has happened over the last couple of years is that, even decades, is that it has become the norm to have activities such as deep plowing, as well as having bare soils throughout the year, and not to apply principles such as cover cropping. So when we see bare soils being the predominant facet or aspect with respect to agriculture, as well as deep plowing that leads to erosion, then that would constitute unsustainability within farming practices, as well as obviously overgrazing, which again leads to bare soils and the opening up of soils. So it's basically the absence of farming with nature, and farming with nature implies keeping the soil covered as far as possible and to minimize soil disturbance. And with the advent of, let's say, modern agriculture, we've seen so much in terms of soil disturbance, and that is per definition not sustainable because of the fact that it is the high erodibility of our soils, and by frequent soil disturbance, we actually accelerate this erosion and the erodibility of our soils, which just cannot be sustained.
Yes, now we've seen that traditionally South Africa has had these huge farms all across the country. We see them in the Free State, in Natal, in other parts of the land as well, where massive plantations have been established for years and years and years. Is this the type of farming that you are saying is now unsustainable, and that we should rather be covering up the soil? And when you say cover up, what would that entail? Is it greenhouses? Are they just shade netting, or what would entail protecting that soil resource?
Yes. What you're referring to is predominantly having the monocropping. So having one crop, let's say maize or wheat or whatever the case is, but in the Free State and so on, it would be maize predominantly. That is a monocrop that has been planted, whereas in nature we know that there's no ecosystem, nowhere in nature that you will have a situation where there's a single species that dominate nature to the extent that we will have in a cropping system. So when we talk about sustainability, and with respect to your question in terms of covering the soil, it's basically actually having a cover crop. So once you've got your crop established, your cash crop, maize or whatever that might be, you introduce also biodiversity in the system through a cover cropping, through crop rotation, through having pollinator strips around it. And then once you've harvested the crop, that you then plant a cover crop. And that cover crop is then again like a green plaster that you put on top of the soil. So by having this green plaster, you can imagine yourself when you have fallen and you're bruised, you have to cover that bruise. And when we plow our fields, it's as if we have fallen. The soil become very much brazen, and we have to cover it. And it's covered by what we also call then a green mulch. So you don't have to go and buy mulch to do it. You can actually have a green mulch, which is then a species that you then plant into that specific area that you have had your cover crop on. And preferably like a cocktail of seeds, not just a single cover crop species again. So a variety of different species that can be planted and planted successfully to act as this green manure, green mulch, sorry, that then covers the land.
Mm. And if you look at the process of investing now, I mean, we've now understood what an unsustainable farming project would look like. There's a lot of money that goes into the investment side of it from financial institutions to keep the farming community alive.
Yeah.
Why are you saying that this is now obviously unsustainable?
Okay, what has happened is that it has become the norm to finance agricultural practice based on what we then define as conventional, or then what has become entrenched in the last couple of decades, monocropping, deep plowing, as well as then leaving the soil barren. But that is contra nature, as we have now discussed, and that is being funded by most financial institutions. But that is breaking down the resilience of the ecosystem. And so, in order to be able to continue farming sustainably going forward into the future, we have to, will require more money, will require more costs, will elevate the debt burden on our farmers. And we have seen that that has happened. As recently as 2010, the debt burden was 100 billion. Now it's already 170 billion rand, what the debt burden is on our farmers. And that debt burden becomes unsustainable as well from a financial perspective. And the two works hand in hand. More money has been thrown at an ecosystem where the resilience is lost. And so you have to throw more money onto a weaker and weaker and weaker natural base, or an ecological base, which then basically means that the farmers just simply cannot repay their that debt, deepening the debt spiral, and also then jeopardizing food security and income security. So in the meanwhile, if we then can convert to regenerative agriculture practices, or then conservation agriculture practices, which then embraces farming with nature, where we have crop rotation, where we do have no tillage or very little soil disturbance, where we do have cover cropping, where you then embrace the natural processes, you will enhance the system resilience. And that, through enhancing the system resilience, will also then enhance the capability of the farmers to repay loans that has been made. And so
Mhm.
financial institutions in general will have to become sensitive to the fact that they will have to change their lending practices to also embrace regenerative and conservation agriculture.
Now, that's obviously something that we look forward to in many, many years to come. This is not something that's an overnight procedure. We are actually discussing the effects that could be very long lasting. Professor, if I could ask you, the new farming techniques, such as the use of greenhouses, hydroponics, aquaponics, do you think that in the future, in years to come, this will begin to eat into the space of traditional farming methods? Or do you think that we still very much will be reliant on ground farming, these huge stretches of land that are needed in order to produce food security?
Thank you. Yes, I think there's a very much a niche for hydroponics, greenhouses, as you've said, net houses, and so on, especially within the space of horticulture, and of vegetables, especially. But when it comes to the starches, our grains, um, it's it's a different kind of production method that is required for our starches, and starch remains our staple. And not going to be able to produce the starches in a hydroponics or in a greenhouses under net houses and so on going forward. So very much so in agreement with what you're saying with respect to the horticulture of vegetables, but with respect to starch, as well, and also proteins, our meat, we will still have to rely, and greatly so, on on nature and what we have available, and therefore so imperative that we actually uh, also support that financially by supporting regenerative agriculture, sustainable means, uh, going side by side then, or hand in hand then, with your more intensive processes like what you've mentioned, net houses and so on, with respect to our vegetables.
And the money that is needed for this, these investments to come into the farming industry or farming sector, where does it traditionally come from? Who funds it?
Normally, the funding will come from our financial institutions, so the banks, who obviously has got a huge responsibility with respect to shareholders, as well as the borrower, the person who's borrowing the money, as well as the depositors, people who have deposited their savings at those financial institutions. But the financial institutions are also corporate citizens. And as corporate citizens, they're also responsible with respect to society at large. And it has got this fourth layer of responsibility, which is increasingly well entrenched in work that the King Commission has done, and what is also called integrated reporting, that it does have that responsibility to also disclose how and where it is spending the money as a corporate citizen to the advantage of the entire society, the country, and eventually, actually, then the entire planet. Because as a funding agent, it has got a tremendous power within society and can actually generate change if it does start to change its lending practices to become also more financially sustainable, but also ecologically sustainable.
Professor Blingnow, if we can take the last question, looking into the future, and I know predicting the future is always risky. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen, even in the next moment. But from your professional estimation, the food security situation in South Africa, where do we stand as a country right now? We've seen, what has happened out in places like Zimbabwe or other countries due to war or famine or whatever the situation there that they faced as challenges. What is South Africa's food security rating right now?
For right now, we are still we have still enough food. Enough food is being produced, but you've said the future is very uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen. But if we have to look forward and make sort of estimated guesses around it, then if the practices do not change, if we continue in farming unsustainably, the land will simply just not be able to produce anymore and support a growing population. And therefore, it becomes increasingly important to actually change our agricultural practices from both sides, the financial side as well as from an ecological side, in order to help us. So we're at the cusp, at the sort of a very important threshold in time, where we still have a window to change the way how we farm, but that window is rapidly closing. And then if we don't change, then we might end up becoming increasingly food insecure. We already see, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, how many people do have hunger, and how many people are suffering from starvation and malnutrition. And that is only going to expand even more if we don't adjust our farming practices.
Professor James Blingnow, Professor Extraordinaire attached to the School of Public Leadership, Stellenbosch University, and Honorary Research Associate attached to the South African Environmental Observation Network. Yes, that brings us to the end of our interview this morning. When we come back, we catch up with the last interview, last segment of the show today.